Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning from California. I'm Dwayne Schultes, the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and today we're going to be discussing the international pricing initiative of both Health and Human Services and some of the Medicare Part D pricing and initial reference pricing proposals that are currently floating around the U.S. Congress. We're going to present original research by Vital Transformation that will be peer-reviewed published in Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science, showing the impact on research and development investments and patient access that will be caused by these pricing initiatives around international reference pricing in the United States. Last October, the Trump administration launched the International Pricing Index, or the IPI. It was a payment model to reduce reimbursement levels for the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And while this proposal was only initially targeting Medicare Part B, the recent proposals coming out of the House of Representatives looking at Medicare Part D and perhaps even the commercial market are going to have a much larger impact. Vital Transformation is joined today by several of our partners who worked on both the Part B project, and some of the folks who are working on the Part D project with us are currently participating as a viewer. And we're going to be discussing the implications of this research as well as the database that we used to make it happen. So I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I'm joined today by Patricia Giglio of MedTrack. She's the Director of Content. Good morning, Patricia. How are you?
Good morning, everyone.
Sue Peshin from the Alliance for Aging Research. Good morning, Sue. How are you?
I'm doing well, Dwayne. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure, Sue. And Joe DeMond from Bio. Hello, Joe. How are you, sir?
I'm here, Dwayne. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Joe. And Patrick Kilbride from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the GIPSI, the Global Innovation Policy Center. Good morning, Patrick. How are you?
Hi, Dwayne. Great to be back with you.
Thank you, sir. So again, we'd just like to point out that this research was made possible with the support of the following organizations. The top two lines, Bio, Gilead, GIPSI, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Pfizer, Amgen, and MedTrack, really helped us with Part B. And I'm going to give you just a slice of some of the initial results of the Part D work we've been doing, and that's been in partnership with Pharma, CLSA, and Biocom. The work we're doing today has been specifically around the California research impact of what's going to happen with Medicare Part D around the California biotech sector, and I'm actually in California today, so it's quite timely. And we're just going to give you a slice of some of the work we're going to be releasing next week in Washington. So again, Medicare Part B, this was announced last year, a year ago, at the Brookings Institution by Secretary Azar. And essentially what they came to the conclusion of with a study of IQVIA was that Medicare Part B drugs cost almost twice as much in the US as they do abroad. So the drugs were going to be put through an average pricing of the international average plus 26%, a small margin of 26%, a markup that would then be a reference price. And this would use a bunch of countries abroad. It would initially focus on Part D drugs that encompass the highest percentage of the spending. Health and Human Services would model this under Section 1115A of the Social Security Act. That's the Obamacare, basically. And what that meant was it did not need congressional approval. It would be run as a test in half of the Medicare market. The model will operate for 5 years from 2020 to 2025, initially rolling out in 50% of Medicare, we assume, divided geographically. One of the most contentious points of the assertion of this is that would only impact R&D by 1%, and that's where we became very interested. And obviously the tacit implication, well, not so tacit actually, I mean, Secretary Azar has said this on numerous occasions. The whole point of this is that the pharmaceutical industry will be pressured to fairly allocate the burden of funding innovation across wealthy countries. In other words, the whole point of this was to try and force the industry to raise prices in Europe and Japan because they're cheaper over there, and America first, and it goes again with a lot of the Trump administration. So I suppose philosophically it makes sense, but we're going to discuss why that may not be so easy. So here are the countries that were benchmarked in Medicare Part B. The Health and Human Service analysis compared essentially these countries: Austria, Belgium, Canada, Czech Republic, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Portugal, Slovakia, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. So essentially, those cumulatively have a price almost half of what it is in the United States. So we're going to take an average at 26%, and then we're going to be paying what they're paying. So then the US is going to try and raise the prices over there, and everyone's going to be happy, and there's not going to be any implications of this. Well, not so much. One of the things you'll find, and what you're seeing in Europe, is the idea that you're going to be able to raise prices in Europe is very challenging. One of the reasons why we started working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Patrick later can probably comment on this, is around the intellectual property aspects of Europe, where they're actually trying to attack intellectual property through what's called a compulsory license. And they're finding that the pricing right now, even at half the price of Medicare Part B injectables, is too high, and it's seen as a public health emergency. At least that's the rhetoric. And so companies that refuse to lower the price of drugs are being threatened to have their actual intellectual property removed by the state, and the state will start producing drugs. Now, we started warning about this 36 months ago, 3 years ago, and people thought we were quite ahead of the curve here and maybe being a little fatalistic or perhaps Chicken Little. But what you've had, Vertex, with cystic fibrosis portfolio of their work and several of their drugs, they've been refusing to lower their price, and the UK government has been threatening to take their intellectual property and produce it themselves. So this is starting to happen. So the idea that these firms are going to be able to unilaterally go to Europe and raise pricing it's probably not going to happen, and you're already seeing a huge amount of pushback. So what we did when we looked at this numerically is we used Health and Human Services' own IPI model that was done by IQVIA, where they looked at the drugs they wanted to model, and they gave the reference price from their own research. So we took that as a given, and then we ran it through the financial corporate information from all the companies in 2017 to see what the impact would actually be. The financials are taken and audited from corporate annual reports by Medtrek and Informa, and Patricia will talk about that later. Our analysis is limited to those medications where the price is above 1.26. Obviously, many of the drugs that were about 6 or 7 of the drugs actually are generic and would go up in price, which we found quite interesting and was probably overlooked in the methodology when they announced it. And again, this assumes the impact is limited to Medicare Part B and would not impact the commercial market. I have to say that Health and Human Services is, at least they're talking about this, which is not being talked about in the Medicare Part D, where they're actually talking about just impairing the commercial market as a matter of course. Now, we don't think that it's going to be possible to isolate this from the commercial market. As you see here, I'm just taking this simple example of the California Teachers Association and CalPERS, the California State Pension Organization. Obviously, the teachers union has their own private insurance, and they would be paying non-IPI reference price products as commercial products and commercial insurance. But then as they retire and they go into Medicare, they would then get a lower price. Now, the Teachers Association has representatives on CalPERS, and the idea that they would be willing or not able to negotiate a similar price that CalPERS people who are on the state pension and working through Medicare, who are getting the drugs, say, for 2/3 cheaper, 66% less, half the price. The idea that this would not get back to a politically driven organization like the California Teachers Union, who would then not push for those pricing, is a fallacy. Of course, there would be documented transparency on these prices in Medicare, and people would push for those lower prices. I don't think it's going to be possible to wall off the commercial market. So what we've done then is looked at what happens if this impacts the commercial market. A couple of things you'll see here, and I'm pulling up an arrow. You'll see here like 3 to 6, these drugs here, the companies who have the most assets, there's a cumulative impact here. The companies who have the most assets actually get hit multiple times in this model. So it actually impacts companies with the most drugs the most. So if you see here, company B with 6 drugs, the total change in revenue here is $6 billion. So that's a huge loss in revenue. And you can see that this relative to their R&D impact that's a $10 billion R&D budget. That's $6 billion loss. That ends up being 60% of their R&D budget. You see company A has 3 drugs. They have a current R&D budget of $3.7 billion. This is $3.8 billion. That ends up being minus 102%. So these are huge revenue impacts at the firm level. And you can see that the R&D impact here, this 20%, traditionally firms allocate 1/5 of their free cash flow directly to the R&D budget. So while we're saying that the cash flow here is 100% of their R&D budget, they would some of that obviously goes to headcount, some of that goes to hiring, some of that goes to facilities management, some of that goes to partnerships and R&D partnerships, which we'll talk about later in Part D. So that 20% of the revenue impact is going to be what is allocated to R&D. So we're going to say at the minimum here for company A that you're going to see a 20% impact on R&D. And you can see here the averages. This is 5 times what Health and Human Services said at 5%. It's not 1%, and it's a quarter of all R&D on average. If you look at this from a funding standpoint, the total impact at this industry level, it's removing 15 billion-ish from the annual revenue. Okay, so that's pretty bad. Now, let's look at Medicare Part D and some of the proposals that are floating around now. Obviously, Medicare Part D, we're not talking 20 drugs. Now we're talking 79 single source brand name drugs. And this is a study that was conducted by House Ways and Means Committee. And what we like about this study is similar to what Health and Human Services did, where they looked at specifically 20 drugs that were the highest spend. These 79 single brand drugs are 70% of the Medicare Part D spend, and they actually look at this from an international reference perspective, and they bring the price down relative to what they feel it should be paid in the US based on an international average. And so we just used their data from this study, and what they found was that US prices averaged 3 to 4 times higher after rebates were considered. And one of the price differentials was 70. Okay, fine. That's up to them at that point. We're not going to get into the specifics of this. We're going to look at the averages. And the estimated cost reduction to Medicare Part D would be $72.9 billion. If we can talk about the Congressional Budget Office, they costed this at $345 billion. We find a similar sort of pricing of around $358 billion. So we're all in the same ballpark with our assessment. What we did is we took Medicare spending from 2017 dashboard of the Medicare spending bill itself, Medicare Part D spending dashboard. Corporate product revenue is taken from 2017 audited annual reports, again, very similar to what we did in our Medicare Part B assessment. We looked at 79 assets in total. There were a few generics in there, as well as some insulin products that are grouped together in the Medicare methodology. So we moved from 79 to 69 just from some consolidation and removing some of the diagnostics and things that had gone generic that were missed in the analysis by the academic group. Reference pricing, again, Health and Human HR3, much like Health and Human Services, where they had 1.26 margin, HR3, the bill coming out of Nancy Pelosi's office in the US Congress, puts a 1.2 margin. So we add the same to Medicare Part D reference pricing. So we add that 2% back, or 20% back in. And as I said earlier, our modeling predicts a drop of about $538 billion over 5 years, similar to what the Congressional Budget Office has said at $334 billion in 5 years. We do not agree with the Congressional Budget Office's assessment that this will only reduce 8 to 10 drugs over 10 years. And I'll show you that we see a far bigger impact of closer to 25 drugs in California alone, which we'll discuss later. So you can see, here's the grid. This is obviously a much bigger grid, because we're dealing with 69 drugs, not 20. A couple things jump out at you, though. You see here that the companies that are the most impacted, these are the ones that have the largest revenue reduction. So this company R has a $9 billion drop in revenue, according to our calculation. So these are 2017 sales. Here are the revised sales based on the reference price. This is the drop according to House Ways and Means study that was published, 73% for this particular group of assets. You can see their change in revenue is $9 billion. You can see this is 195% of their average R&D spend. That ends up being 39%, even at the 20% ratio. This is a devastatingly huge hit for Company R. You can see Company D, 5 assets, $6 billion in lost revenue. 161 is relative to their total R&D budget, 32%. So you can see the numbers here are far, far larger. Companies that have more assets in Medicare Part D are hit cumulatively more. Companies, do you see that down here we have a collection of companies with 1 or 2 assets, they have less of a hit. But still, if we just look at the gross numbers here of what's going to happen, we have a $72 billion impact in Medicare Part D. This is per year, and that's where we get our $350-ish billion 5-year impact, which aligns very well with the Congressional Budget Office assessment of what is going to happen. So what happens when you look at the $71 billion relative to the free cash flow of these companies? Well, you see here, if you look at all the companies, and this is just from the size of the company per year, starting with Company Q that has the largest revenue of $17 billion, and then we had a couple of companies that had quite major losses. Company B lost $10 billion. But if you look at the cumulative amount of free cash flow, that's earnings at the end of the year minus impairments, that's roughly $125 billion. But if you look at the amount we're talking about then, with Part D, HR3, which is adding that 20% margin back in after the reference price. So the best case scenario with the full commercial market impact, it's $72 billion. That ends up being 58% of the stated annual revenue of the pharmaceutical industry companies who are impacted by Medicare Part D. This is a devastating amount of revenue loss. This will have huge implications for R&D and innovation in America. So what we wanted to do was extrapolate out, similar to what we'd done for those of you who'd seen our research and some of the presentations we'd done at Bio. We wanted to look at the implication for products coming to market. We wanted to look at the biotech sector as a whole and what would happen with innovation. So we extracted based on these companies who were impacted in Medicare Part D. We looked at the entire investment ecosystem then in which they were involved from the period of 2009 to 2019 from October. And we found that they invested $621 billion over those 10 years. And the funding is obviously, these are in partnerships, mergers and acquisitions. These are direct investments outside of R&D. These are looking at ways to get, develop asset collaborations, IP sharing, coming in with partnerships that look at co-development. I mean, a lot of deals are done increasingly where you're looking at promising assets coming from small biotech, and then you try to develop them together. And then when the product is, if it's fine and looks great and it has huge market potential, often these companies are acquired and incorporated in for commercialization into the larger partner. So what we found is from 2009 to 2019, the $621 billion was invested across the United States. 178, so almost 200 billion of that just went to California alone. So almost 30% of the total just lives in California. And that's 85 biotech firms received 178 billion. So roughly 30% of the total invested went to 85 firms in California. And of those 85 firms, 25 received marketing authorization, which is a slightly higher hit rate than we'd normally expect, which shows that California is punching above its weight. So we wanted to see, okay, what are the statistical implications of this? So we split out those products. These are the 25 that came to market. And what you see here, here's the revenue potential they generate. So here's the amount of annual revenue we saw in 2017 from these products. And here's the total amount invested. And what you immediately start to see is the smaller the revenue, the smaller the investment. So the investors are quite savvy in investing in assets and pulling things to market. And what you also notice is that it takes roughly about $500 million to $1 billion to even get something to market. And even if you spend $500 million or $1 billion, there's a lot of zeros here. These are products that even though they came to market, they have no sales or they've been withdrawn from the market. So there's no guarantee here, folks. And essentially what we look at this as is, there's a certain amount of money you need to play the biopharma game. If you look at it like a poker table, you have about $500 million to $1 billion. You can try to play cheap and only put in 100 million or so, but those assets don't generate much revenue, certainly not to sustain a company. So you need roughly $500 million or $1 billion to play at the pharmaceutical poker table and actually get a deck of cards and ante in and play. And there's no guarantee then, because you know that about 90% of those are going to fail. So what we said was how statistically significant is the relationship between this revenue and coming to market? And what we found was a very high statistical correlation between the amount that's invested and the amount of revenue that the asset generates. In other words, this is a constant, and that once you have invested that 500 million, you won't go any further unless you know that those assets are going to generate more revenue. So what that means is if you reduce revenue by 58%, a lot of these assets that did come to market that don't generate enough revenue to justify it, if you're cutting that revenue in half, they no longer are viable assets and they will not be brought to market. And things that are more risky, we look at Alzheimer's disease, neurological disorders, Parkinson's, things that require 10 years outcomes trials, cardiovascular disease trials, 10,000 people for 10 years to look at outcomes. Those things will disappear. There will not be the revenue to support that. We don't see how they will be supportable. Plus, we also know that the cumulative amount that is invested at the firm level, not necessarily the asset level, we can also predict at the firm level, the more money that goes into a firm, the more likely it is that an asset will come to market. So we also know that investing at the firm also predicts if a firm asset will come to market. And again, with a very high statistical certainty. So we know we can track revenue to determine if a product comes to market. And what this means is you're dealing with constants. You are dealing with a constant of 8% success, 92% failure. That does not change even if we reduce revenue. We also know that there's a certain amount of revenue you need just to prove that the asset comes to market or it's marketable, $500 million, roughly, give or take, just a minimum amount that you need to show, and you're going to lose that most of the time because most of those are going to fail. So essentially, if your only lever that you have to play is the amount of times you make that bet, the amount of times you go to the table and ante, the only option you have is less drugs. That's it. You will only be able to invest in less assets if you reduce that revenue by 60%. And the problem is it's a nonlinear relationship because the larger assets with the most market potential require the largest investment. So while we do believe the Congressional Budget Office has done a linear calculation, we feel that this is inappropriate and incorrect. And what will happen is you will gut out a large percentage of the innovation because the money will concentrate only in those large market assets that actually provide the largest return on investment. It's also highly likely that pricing will not go down because you will still need to invest large amounts to bring those very large market assets to market, and those will be the only ones that are sustainable. So looking to this chart, in the current situation, everything in green came to market, but as you reduce that revenue radically, and because those assets required a much smaller amount of investment than the larger investments that have market moving potential, the ones at the top of the chart, that the ones that really drive the industry, you're going to scatter and lose those less valuable assets. You will not bring them to market because they do not justify the $500 million investment to bring them to market. And many of those assets are oncology products. Many of those assets are things that treat people. And this is a nonlinear relationship, folks. It is not one-to-one. So all of this to say, what this overlooks is the US is dominating right now in mergers and acquisitions. Most late stage, mid stage, promising assets, biotech assets that are not based in the United States are coming to the United States. And I highly recommend everybody to listen to the podcast I just released at Vital Transformation yesterday with Eduardo Bravo, the former CEO of Tygenix, and he talks about the difficulty of trying to commercialize ChrondoSelect Tygenix first, ATMP, Advanced Therapy in Europe. They were not able to do so on the revenue of Europe alone, and the company then had to move in another direction and do a listing on the NASDAQ, an initial public offering, in order to be viable. This shows that 70% of all assets are moving to the United States. And you can see that cumulatively the investment, $500 billion has been made and invested in the United States. And these are assets that are all moving into America. And you can see we're absolutely dominating the sector. And this is data from US and California that you can see quite conclusively. Sorry, folks. You can see quite conclusively here that job growth is also following this movement of assets into California. We see high amounts of job growth. We see high amounts of industrial impacts because these assets are all moving into the United States. This is being overlooked in Medicare Part D. Not only will we lose the assets, we're also going to lose the jobs, we're going to lose the investment, we're going to lose the domination that the US currently has in the market. So again, just quickly to finish off, reference pricing ignores the cumulative impact on companies that have multiple products. That's the first thing. It penalizes innovation. It's going to impact R&D far more than 1%. It assumes companies will be able to raise prices in Europe. We do not think this is possible. In fact, they're going to probably run into compulsory licenses. It attacks the amount of liquidity available for investments in new products, manages mergers and partnerships. It's going to stop drugs coming to market. It's going to radically reduce the amount of assets we see. It believes that reducing Medicare prices will not reduce innovation. That's patently false. This is completely wrong. And it ignores the reality that the US is currently buying and dominating the global biotech sector, owning 70% of all assets and controlling all global job growth in the biotech sector. It's really kind of wrong-headed. So with that, good news, I suppose. I'm going to pass over to Patricia Giglio, who's going to talk about MedTrack, because we have a lot of questions about the database we use. We rely on MedTrack a lot, and people question provenance. So Patricia, please, if you can just tell us a little bit about MedTrack and why we use your data, please.
Sure. So hello again. I'm the content director for MedTrack, which, as Dwayne has said, much of the data used in today's presentation was analyzed from MedTrack. So it's a business intelligence provider that takes a comprehensive view of the global pharma and biotech business landscape. Next slide, please. So all types of companies are analyzed, from small startups to key players in the industry. We monitor their investments and partnership agreements, revenues, R&D spending, and drug development pipelines. And this enables us to gain insight into emerging trends and opportunities. The coverage is global in scope, with 48,000 companies across the life sciences, tracking their activities from healthcare players focused on pharma and biotech to med device companies and about a dozen additional sectors. Information like news, investments, and development pipelines are monitored in real time, and the statuses of the companies and their progression over time is very closely monitored. Close to 170,000 deals and investments have been captured, and they include partnerships, mergers and acquisitions, public offerings, venture financings, and private placements. Financial terms like royalty payments and milestone payments are monitored and updated as they become available in the public domain. So this type of company and drug information supports various functions like market research, building market models, following drug development events, and identifying licensing and investment opportunities. In fact, investment research in particular is supported by monitoring real-time updates of funding by company type and therapy area. So data curation requires a rigorous editorial process involving these three major steps. First, there is the daily scanning and reviewing of thousands of sources and news outlets. Also included are SEC filings, earnings reports, and investment conferences, which are reviewed for company and deal information. Additional drug sources include trial registries, regulatory agencies, and scientific meetings and journals. And then once the data is captured, a team of in-house analysts review the information for new or updated intelligence. And then following a thorough quality assurance review process, the information is then disseminated to the MedTrack platform. And in addition, each company and drug record undergo a comprehensive periodic review for relevant updates. And that is a summary of how the investments and developments within the pharma and biotech space are monitored and reported in MedTrack.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We have a lot of questions always about the database we use and the provenance, et cetera. So again, everyone, I'd highly recommend you contacting Patricia if you have any more questions. We use MedTrack exclusively for a lot of our research work. We're very happy with it. And again, I hope that satisfies any questions that you have. I'd like to bring everybody in, Sue, Patrick, and Joe. I'd like to ask you now to comment. Sue, from your perspective, just obviously you know the Medicare Part B work. We work very closely on it. I'd like to get your opinion on what you think this is going to have from patients' perspective, as well as how you see it impacting Medicare Part D.
Thank you, Dwayne. And you and I just did a piece that covers some of these issues in Stat News. It was in a couple of days ago, so if folks want to check that out. I appreciate the research that you all are doing because it shows that, you know, not only the hit to research and development, but that it's not likely to translate to reducing costs for older adults, for beneficiaries in Medicare at the pharmacy counter. And that's significant. That's what they're trying to do in Congress. And if a policy that they're proposing is not going to accomplish that, then they should take another look. We're really concerned that the United States is now taking a look at adopting policies from other countries that use discriminatory cost-effectiveness standards that were previously outlawed here. And what I mean by that is that many of the countries that are referenced in the International Pricing Index, like the UK and Canada and Greece, they base their cost-effectiveness on the use of quality adjusted life years, or QALYs for short. And the premise behind that is you're assigning a financial value to the patient for whom a given treatment is intended. And I really want people to absorb that, because we don't do that with other consumer products. When you're getting a car or a house or something else, we're not assigning a financial value to the consumer that's going to use those things. We assign a value to the things that we're going to purchase and make sure that we're getting the value out of what we're purchasing. But for some reason with this, we're sort of seeing it in a different way. And when I say it's discriminatory, if you think about it, this type of a model automatically dings folks that are older and people with disabilities because they're not in perfect health. And anything less than perfect health is assigned a value that's a negative. So laws that we've had on the books for a number of years, from the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, and even more recently, Obamacare outlawed use of QALYs for cost effectiveness, and they've been found subsequently to not be viable for use within the Medicare and Medicaid programs. But now all of a sudden we're embracing it. So it's discriminatory. And this thing also started out, use of QALYs started out in the 1960s really to ration care. So that's the other piece of things. We're discriminating, and then we're also saying that we're open to rationing care. Some people are going to get, some people aren't going to get, and folks need to know that. Now, within the H.R. 3 on the House side, in the drug pricing proposals, Title I of that legislation includes both the International Pricing Index proposal, and it also includes a reference to ICER, the Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research, which is an organization based up in Boston that folks are taking a look at, that also uses QALYs. And so we're sort of concerned about these proposals on both of those fronts. It's a bit of a QALY-palooza in Title I of that House legislation. And, you know, we want to try to educate policymakers and the public about it to recognize that this is not something we previously embraced. It would be a huge change in public policy, and we don't want to go down this path.
Thanks, Sue. And I'd like to point out we're going to be taking questions from the audience here. Please submit a question from your question bar. We have one from Robert that I'll be getting to later. Joe, I'd like to pick up on something Sue mentioned. I mean, obviously, you're the head of the International for Bio, so you work internationally with all your members. You know, Sue mentioned the rationing aspects, you know, and what I found fascinating in the Ways and Means study that was published, the Kim Young-soon article, there wasn't one other country that had all 79 drugs that they were analyzing actually in patient access. Most of the countries only had 40 or 50 of those drugs. What's your opinion of, you know, putting in a reference price from the standpoint of access and commercialization, Joe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think you've pretty well outlined the effect it would have on research and development. And that, of course, has an impact on access because although you can't quantify it, but there will be medicines that simply aren't developed and brought to market. So that, you know, that's something, let's not take that for granted. That's a key part. But I think the other part is what you're asking more directly about is, you know, what kind of access do these single payer systems provide for medicines? And people assume that sometimes, even if they're just being reimbursed as part of their system, that people are getting access to that. And let me just say, it's much more complicated than that. And the data is correct. First of all, there are products that are available to patients in the US today that are not available at all in many of these countries because the governments have just basically decided not to reimburse them, or you know, the company itself has decided that it's just not, it doesn't make business sense to actually launch in that country because of prices being imposed on them. So that it has access and implications in that way. Secondly, what we're seeing in a number of European countries are significant delays under their system. So in the US, once you get regulatory approval by the US FDA, you know, you will have generally within a fairly short time access to those medicines in the marketplace. In Europe, you have to go through another, most of these countries, another bureaucratic process, which is to determine how much, quote, extra value or extra therapeutic value the drug has, if any. And that can take up to a year or more. So in France, it's getting very, for just to take one example of a leading and very well-praised healthcare system in Europe, I don't think people realize that there's a delay of about a year on average for drugs actually being reimbursed by the government, which means that they're not being prescribed by doctors until that point. So that has an implication for access. I do want to say also that these governments are also, another thing that people don't understand is that governments are in approving, even when they do approve a drug for reimbursement by the program, they'll set conditions under which the drug can actually be used and prescribed. And those conditions can be narrower or much narrower in some cases than that which has actually been approved by the regulatory agency. Because what they're basically saying is that they'll put people on some sort of step therapy where, okay, you know, this, you know, cancer medicine or for whatever, we will pay for this, but only after a patient, you know, fails on a number of other older therapies first, or only if they're extreme cases, will you be allowed to prescribe this. So when you look at the statistics, even where it says patients won't have access to it, what you don't realize is that the state itself, the central governments in those countries, are telling doctors the conditions under which they can prescribe those medicines. I just make one final point, which is, it builds on the point that Sue was making about the use of QALYs, is that even for all the faults that QALYs have, and they do, in addition to that, you have to keep in mind that QALYs do not take into account a number of the benefits that patients or their families may have from access to new medicines, such as shorter disability periods, such as greater economic productivity, such as shorter care periods by caregivers if patients are cured faster or treated faster. None of those are considered legitimate sources of value in assessing the value of new medicine in most of these countries. So they systematically tend to, just aside from all the inherent problems that a QALY has, which Sue outlined, they systematically tend to undervalue what the value of a new medicine is, which also leads to them being prescribed or restrictions being put on them because the government doesn't consider them sufficiently valuable to be for patients to have broad access to them.
Thanks, Joe. We've got a couple people who are taking umbrage with our piling on QALY. So we'll have to address that later. And in the interest of fairness, I definitely want to do that. I'd also like to get to Patrick, though. Now, Patrick, you and I met and began collaborating because of our concern about compulsory licensing in Europe. Just broadly, the idea that that we'll be able to control and raise prices on some of these drugs in Europe. Well, how do you think that that's going to happen? And do you think that this is even plausible?
Thanks, Dwayne. The policy proposals that you've flagged here in the United States, as well as some of those in Europe, such as compulsory licensing, really should raise a red flag for all of us. They suggest to me that as a society, we're taking innovation for granted. And while, at the U.S. Chamber, we have a mantra that innovation happens everywhere, I think the reality is that while people everywhere have the capacity to be innovative, breakthrough, transformative innovation has historically only taken place in a handful of countries. And that's especially true of the market for biopharmaceutical products. And the graph that you showed earlier about the share of biopharma investment taking place in the United States, I think was very illustrative of that fact. So there's a real danger here that we're going to kill the goose that's laying the golden eggs. Part of our role at GIPC is to help governments understand the process by which innovation happens. And it begins many years before a product reaches market with corporate investments in intellectual capital formation, hiring the researchers, assembling the research facilities, building the business processes, the manufacturing processes to support that business and a product that can ultimately come to market and treat diseases and other health conditions. And it's a highly risky process. You pointed to the failure rates. 90% of medicines entering clinical trials will never make it to a patient, 95% in the oncology space. That means that to sustain a pipeline of innovative medicines, one successful medicine has to pay for all the R&D and all the overhead that goes into the rest of the pipeline. And as a human society, we want a robust pipeline. We want more medicines in the market. The implications of the reductions in revenue that you pointed to are inevitably that there will be less and less yes decisions within these innovative biopharma companies. They're going to have to narrow down the pipeline of medicines that they're willing to take risks on to the safer bets. That is not something that we want to see. So how do you avoid that? Number one, you build in transparency, predictability, and ultimately reliability in your system through strong, consistent upholding of private property rights. And then you encase that in a systemic respect for the rule of law. So you don't, as a government, you don't reach back and change your mind and say, well, IP rights are important, but in this case, there are overriding factors. You don't do that. You don't change the rules retrospectively, because that changes the investment equation. And as we know, Dwayne, you referenced this earlier, money is fungible. There is no guarantee that investment dollars are going to flow into the biopharmaceutical industry. There's no guarantee that investment dollars will flow to specific companies that are disproportionately impacted by some of these pricing proposals. So I think it's very important that we look holistically at this problem, and the work that you've done to take this to a firm level is just really super important. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. We have a couple questions here. And again, people listening, there's 100 of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please submit a question. We'll do our best to answer, and a comment. For a couple people quite upset about our attacking of quality. So got some stuff for you, Sue. But first, we're going to talk about this question from Robert Lizewski. And Robert's asking, do the proposals anticipate manufacturers either withdrawing or not launching products in the 16 reference markets identified? Well, I've got an opinion on that, but Joe, let me go first to you. What do you think is going to happen if we're referencing products in markets in Europe that impact revenue and profit in the US? Are we going to withdraw or withhold? What do you reckon, Joe?
Well, to answer, let me just say, first of all, the administration has been saying that what it would like the impact to be would be for companies to threaten to leave, and if they don't get a better price, and to walk away if they don't. The reality is that I think companies are going to be very reluctant to do this, and I think you'll see very few people doing that, because for several reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is that these are medicines. These aren't widgets that we're selling to people, that our companies are selling to people. You're not, it's not easy once a drug, especially once a drug's been launched in a country, to just walk away from your patients and not expect it to have any impact on your patients, and not to expect it to have any impact on your reputation in that market. And you do care, and companies do care both about the patients and about their reputation. Secondly, they don't feel, I think, that it would have any impact anyway, that if you threaten to walk away, that you would have much impact on changing a government's behavior or getting a higher price, because these are single payers. They, basically are the only purchaser of the drug in that market. If you want to have access at all to the 80 million patients in Germany, the alternative to having a lower price than you would like is to have zero revenue in that country. And I just don't think companies are going to make that decision, in addition to the reasons I've already said. So I don't really think that's what's going to happen in terms of exiting those markets.
What about slow walking the negotiation?
In those countries?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's any number of strategies that you might want to put in place, but I would just say that generally, companies are, and there are different opinions, different companies have different strategies, but generally speaking, every company that has a drug that's been approved by the EMA or by the FDA has a clock ticking, a patent clock ticking, or an IP clock ticking in terms of when its IP expires, and a clock ticking in terms of its competitors who are developing similar technologies. Both of those lead companies to want to get their products reimbursed, get them onto the market to patients sooner rather than later. So I don't know if it would benefit to slow walk. It could benefit to slow walk in some markets, to the extent that some markets are reference priced by other countries. For example, if everybody is referencing Greece, and that Greece is actually a less wealthy country and it's going to set a very low price, you might not launch first in a country like that. You might try to find a country, and every company has a proprietary strategy for doing this, for the sequencing in which you launch.
Yeah, and Joe, I should add, one of the points is if you don't exercise your patent, and maybe Patrick, you could comment to this, if the companies aren't actively exercising their patent, they can't lose the patent rights. Isn't that correct, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. And Joe is right to point out that the companies they're in the business of getting cures to patients. So they're trying to bring these medicines to market as quickly as possible. I think what we've seen is that governments actually cause most of the delays with policies that get in the way of reimbursement of new medicines, that get in the way of delivery of new medicines to market through intervention on licensing, for instance, of IP, in terms of some forced localization measures that really incentivize companies to avoid a market. And when you see governments resort to compulsory licensing, which essentially waives the intellectual property right for the innovator, what that says is this is not a market in which you should invest your time or resources.
Sue, have you been speaking to some of your patient colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic, and what's their feeling about reference pricing and this issue of access, or are they concerned about companies would slow walk or not release?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's already awareness that survival rates differ in the countries, where, we're talking about referencing against. So, there is an acknowledgement that there's rationing in countries that have the single payer systems, and it shows up in their 5-year survival rates. If you look at the major types of cancer, you see it. The survival rates are higher in the US compared to Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, if you're looking at breast, colon, lung, and prostate cancers. So I think, there is a concern. A lot of times folks come from other countries to the United States to get their treatments. So it's going to have an impact here.
Patricia, I've got just a straight up business question to ask you from your standpoint. Since you folks monitor all of the deal flow globally, what do you think would happen from your perspective of the amount of activity you would see in your database and just the amount of activity in general if there was if this came to fruition, there was a 60% revenue cut? How much activity do you think, what would be the impact from your perspective looking at all the data?
Well, I think there certainly would be an impact because right now companies are willing to, the shift was a few years ago to acquire those small companies or at least drugs early on in the pipeline development phase because the bulk of the R&D was already spent. But when you consider, in licensing a drug or so on, there still is cost associated. So it all depends on the revenue, and if revenue is cut back, well, so will partnerships, and likely any other type of investments as well.
Thank you.
Brain,
yes, please go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, you talked about the ecosystem in your introduction, and I think there could be no question that when you reduce the size of the firms in an industry, you reduce the size of the ecosystem that surrounds them. So when you think about, innovative hubs like Cambridge or California, that countries really want to replicate and develop in their own markets, what makes those work is the presence of other industry players, partners, stakeholders who have skills that they can bring to the table. It creates a very dynamic ecosystem for innovation. When you start to shrink the main players, the main investors, what happens to all those people? They go away too.
Sure. Okay, we have Karen Facey who submitted a question here. She said, I've never heard such a biased presentation regarding qualities. I guess that's for all of us. I would totally disagree with this representation. It's about comparing costs and consequences of new treatment. Okay, so it does, I will say this, what a quality does do is set a base level of comparators depending on what the value is. If I could just add, the quality in the US now is 125 to 200,000. The quality in the UK is 35,000 pounds. Do I honestly think a life in the UK is less than half the value of a life in the United States? I do think there's some certain elements of quality that do not value very well. One of the things, if I can just add, we did some work on CAR T, and we looked at the ICER study, and the ICER did an extrapolation based on 6 months of data out 2 years. The data we saw in the study that was published in the British Medical Journal that we just published ourselves, what we found was that the ICER methodology did not actually track extremely well to the actual use of the drug in clinical practice. So essentially what you saw was a divergence between what was happening in clinical research and what was actually happening in practical application when you got it to the doctors. And that has huge consequences and reimbursement consequences at the level of the hospital. Sue, getting back to you, what are some alternatives? I mean, again, if we're saying that we're not happy with quality and ICER, and obviously, you know, our firm, we do a lot of work in comparative effectiveness modeling, where we can go head to head. We use real world data to look at the actual performance of two assets. What are some alternatives from your patient's perspective and your for stakeholders, which you would rather advocate if we're not happy with quality?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and we actually do need some new models. I mean, that I think is oftentimes sort of like a fallback argument, like, well, what else are we going to have? And this is the only thing we have, so we have to use it. And I do think there's a place for the National Institutes of Health and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute to be working together in the United States to identify some alternatives to quality use. I think you run into it in particular with new treatments that have no other competitors. When you have treatments that have competitors, that's where comparative clinical effectiveness research comes in, where you're able to sort of take a look at outcomes, comparing one treatment to another, what matters to patients, and then, you know, kind of figure all that in to take a look at what makes the most sense for given populations. But it also, you need to look at subgroups. There's a lot of things that qualities, they sort of generalize. And I think it was Joe who said, you know, you're not adjusting for severity and illness, for levels of disability. So there's a lot it leaves out. So we need alternatives. There are some groups that are looking at disease-specific measures for value. There are value agreements that are starting to be developed in demonstration projects with CMMI. So there's some stuff going on, but we definitely, this is sort of bringing to the fore, we need alternatives for how we consider value.
If I could just add as well, if we look at the controversy around Sovaldi, Gilead's hepatitis C drug, and I know I talk about Sovaldi a lot just because it is such an interesting case. Sovaldi, from all health economic studies and ICER as well as quality, was extremely cost effective, yet everyone still screamed bloody murder that the drug wasn't worth the money. Joe, do you want to comment on, you know, the Sovaldi case? Because here was a case where the quality did work and everyone was still upset.
Well, I don't know if I want to comment on a specific member's case, but let me just say this, that, you know, quality is an attempt, but it's an, you know, for a lot of technical reasons, I would think, and I agree with Sue, an imperfect attempt to try to come up with a number for the comparative value of a product. And let me just say this, you know, you are putting, as you said, a dollar number on a person's life. That number is not scientific. That number ends up becoming political at the end of the day. That's what people, I think,
yeah.
So the country of the world that actually has the lowest quality threshold is probably New Zealand. New Zealand values their lives at something like 20,000 or less US dollars. And the implication of that is, by the way, that New Zealand has now 100 fewer new products that have been listed in the last several years than in the US. So that was not a scientific decision based on what was the best for New Zealand patients. That was a political decision that we're going to value a person's life at this particular amount, and it had specific and very predictable outcomes in terms of access to medicines in that country. So, you know, there is no way around the political dimension of setting if once you get down the road of, you know, and there's a certain arbitrariness to it because it really depends on New Zealand and other countries on what the government decides they can, quote, afford. What they can, quote, afford in New Zealand also means that they may have a higher priority on paving roads than they do on providing access to medicines, and it gets into a whole lot of other things. So I think what I and Sue I think are saying, I'll speak for myself, is that you know, it's not that this is not a well-intentioned attempt to try to compare one medicine to another, but I think you have to really understand what its limitations are. And finally, just to amplify something else that Sue said, and, you know, if others want to talk about this, we could talk about this for hours. And I'm sure we don't want to. But the other thing is that inevitably, the thing that equality does is talk about averages. So if you're a cancer patient and the average additional lifespan added by new drug is X number of months, well, some of those patients that get that drug are actually cured, and some aren't, you know, don't see any improvement at all. You don't know which category you're in beforehand, but I can tell you that the government's going to look at the average, and they're going to decide whether to reimburse that drug based on not what the best case scenario is, what your family, you know, will want to take that chance on, but on what they consider the average. And there's no way around that because equality is an average.
Thank you, Joe. We've got just a couple, 3 minutes left. And yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation. Just any final points, Sue, any final comments on the Medicare reform from your perspective? Anything you would like to take home messages that you'd like to get out to everyone?
I mean, I just want to put out there that we're not, you know, sort of negative Nellies about everything. We're very excited that both sides of the aisle have been trying to tackle these issues. This is a big deal for older adults. The discussions around out-of-pocket caps, smoothing, the Part D restructuring, just there's a lot of things that are on the table that to us are very exciting. We would love to see a resurgence of the rebate rule reconsidered in the U.S. So there's a lot of good stuff going on, and it's not all about the negative, but we do want to make sure that, you know, we turn away from things that are discriminatory. We don't have to go for that just because it looks like it's going to give us a big return. It's in the end, it's not.
Patricia, anything you want people to take away from the webinar today from your perspective at MedTrack?
Just that, you know, I think that's a good point you made, Sue. We don't want to sound so negative, just maybe cautious about the way we proceed, but without innovation, none of us would be here. So it is just something that we want to continue and maybe perhaps find some alternative ways to continue that innovation, especially with all the promising treatments that are out there.
Thank you. Patrick, final comments from you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. You know, innovation is a new thing. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that we've seen this explosion of sustainable innovation, and it's been in the healthcare space, in food production, in energy sustainability. God knows we need it for climate issues. It has to be sustained. It depends on the conditions that enable investment, and it's largely private sector investment. We cannot lose sight of that.
Thank you. Joe, final word from you, sir.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate some of the earlier, I mean, we're certainly not saying that everything about pricing system or the healthcare system in the U.S. is perfect. It certainly isn't, and there are a lot of inefficiencies in it. And there are a lot of things that could and should be done to make it better in terms of making healthcare more affordable and making access more broadly available to people. But what we don't want to do is to do it in a heavy-handed way that'll have an impact on patients that have untreated or untreatable diseases like Alzheimer's or all sorts of cancers, and keep an eye on innovation. And so to keep an eye on the impact of these policies on innovation, we are very nervous about the way that the Congress and some of these proposals and the administration, some of these proposals are going about doing that. I think we're fortunate to date that, and you might comment on this, Dwayne, that investors, it has not seemed to have a big impact yet on the investment in future technologies, because I think it's still a amount of uncertainty about the direction that the U.S. Congress will go. But if they really were, if it was really clear that they were going to head down one of these paths that you've outlined, I think it would have an impact on the amount that very clearly you've shown that investors would be willing to put behind these technologies. And that's a very scary prospect indeed for the industry.
Yeah, Joe, and just on with your point, I do think that the investment community generally is optimistic because they see the assets and they see the quality of the research and they're very positive. But I'd also like to point out that Jim Cramer had Bear Stearns a buy 2 days before it went to zero. So you know, we can never underestimate the ability of people to do irrational things. And I hope that my takeaway from this is the U.S. is doing, spending half my time in Europe and the U.S. Our firm is, you know, both sides of the Atlantic. I'm having the pleasure of working more in the U.S. these days, and it's nice to be home working in the U.S. But please, folks, don't think that things are great in Europe. They're not. And the biotech sector is being strangled and dying. It's being bled of cash flow. And the U.S. is really dominating right now. And I think we just need to be very, very, very careful. And that's my message. Don't do anything rash here, folks, because we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. With that, thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's been fantastic, and I appreciate your time very much. And everyone in the audience, all 100 of you, thank you very much for your stick-to-itiveness and for your participation. And with that, I'll call the webinar closed. Good afternoon, everyone.